There is so little fantasy football off-season left, and nailing your draft picks, it is so important. This is Fantasy Sanctuary. I'm Tom Strachan. That's Rich Coolin. We've been asking fantasy football experts for their favorite 3 draft picks in drafts, and today we've got the man many associate with the phrase late-round QB, JJ Zachariason. JJ, it's been a long and busy off-season poring over the same data we've had since the 2023 season ended. How excited are you to get something new, some meaningful data in a couple of weeks' time?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's almost like, whenever you're back in school and you were studying for a test and you're just like cramming all this information in, and then you take the test and you get to see how you did. And that's kind of what it's like with fantasy football and football, right? Where like all off season, we're cramming, we're trying to figure out how to answer these things and the answers to these questions. We're going to get a lot more wrong though in the fantasy football world than we would get in a regular test, hopefully, unless you were a pretty bad student.
I think that's a great point. Rich, like if you had one thing that you're most scared about getting wrong, what is it?
I think it's just accepting that you're going to get a lot wrong. So don't get scared that you're going to get one thing wrong, quite frankly, because you look back at any season, by the time week 1, week 2, you've had 9 months of off-season takes. It all goes out the window as soon as the real NFL starts.
Absolutely. But the thing that we can promise on is that these 3 players are all going to be worth your time tonight. We're going to start with Jaylen Waddle, a player that I'm very high on. He's going in a wide variety of spots across redraft. On Underdog, he goes at the 19th pick, CBS 43rd, ESPN 50th, all across that range on different platforms. He's had 3 1,000-yard seasons and over 100 targets in each of his first 3 years in the NFL. It just didn't really break right for him in 2023, JJ. Like, are you supremely confident in Jaylen Waddle? Like, would you take him in every single draft if you could?
Yeah, I like him a lot. And you kind of mentioned that, like, we have kind of a stable floor for Waddle that we can feel confident in from a projection standpoint. And, especially on like Underdog right now, where you look at what happens at the start of the second round, really that 1-2 turn is when it starts to just get really ugly. And you could make the argument that Waddle could be drafted at the 1-2 turn with like a Drake London type. Like what is the reason to have so much conviction about one of those guys over the other is the real point. And Waddle will sometimes fall to the late second, and you can get him in that spot. When to me, the upside is there for him just as much as it is for these other guys being drafted there. One of the ADP trends that I found that I think is definitely worthwhile to look at with a guy like Waddle. You can throw Devontae Smith in there too. But when you're looking at team wide receiver 2s who are being drafted as wide receiver 2s, so in that wide receiver 13 to 24 range, the team wide receiver 2s, so Jaylen Waddle, Devontae Smith, we've had other guys in the past. We've actually had like 35, 36 of them since 2014. Team wide receiver 2s have actually outperformed wide receiver 1s in the wide receiver 2 range when they're drafted in that range, when I think that the narrative is actually the opposite. The narrative is that you want to get a wide receiver 1. Why would you take a team wide receiver 2 in that range when they obviously have a better wide receiver, hypothetically, being drafted ahead of them? And so I think the reason we see what we see is because if you're a team wide receiver 2 being drafted that high, more than likely you're a good player. There's a talent profile that's really strong, but also there's a contingent upside factor. And with Jaylen Waddle, even Devontae Smith, but with Jaylen Waddle, there's a contingent upside factor that I feel like has not been really pushed to the forefront enough this offseason, where if Tyreek Hill were to go down, Jaylen Waddle's a 30% target share per week kind of player from a projection standpoint. We would be looking at him being probably pretty comfortably in the top 12 at the position week in and week out if Tyreek Hill were not in the picture. And then you look at his peripherals last year, he was still 94th and 92nd percentile in yards per route run and targets per route run. It was really, he couldn't stay healthy. That was his biggest issue last year. If the health is there, he's in one of the better offenses in football. He's seen at least a 20% target share per game every year of his NFL career. To me, he's just a very easy pick because you're drafting him around his projection, maybe even a little bit lower than his projection, but there is that upside that you can't always find with other players sort of in that range. So I really like Jaylen Waddle in every format.
Yeah, Rich, how often are you clicking Jaylen Waddle? I mean, for me, this is an easy one just because I just don't see the Dolphins scoring as many rushing touchdowns as they did last year. They'll be more swinging back to the passing game as well. Are you aligned with myself and JJ on this one?
Yeah, I love the Waddle pick, and I love the value that you can get of him, as you said, in that second round. I think to your point, this offense is probably going to see some sort of change this year. We talk about the high volume of rushing touchdowns, but this offensive line was depleted last year. It wasn't a good offensive line to begin with. You've then lost pieces out of it.
Up.
I think, just banking it in, yes, it is a fantastic rushing scheme. But at some point, that offensive line talent has kind of got to affect that. So we know that Tua has one of the fastest time to throw in the league, yet still manages to push the ball down the field at a decent rate. So to me, that's fantastic for a guy like Waddle who wins immediately off the line of scrimmage. But we talked earlier about, JJ saying he struggled through 2023 in terms of the injury side. I don't think we quite appreciate the volume of injuries that he had last year. These are injuries that he appeared on the injury report for last year. Okay. Concussion, missed a game. He then had back soreness, knee soreness, bruised chest, and a high ankle sprain that he missed the last 2 games of the regular season. Like, that's one season. He played through nearly all of those injuries through the year. Like, the fact that he put up the fantasy numbers he did with that cacophony of injuries is phenomenal. And he still had really great numbers. As JJ said, this is a wide receiver 2, but he's getting, target per route run numbers of most teams' wide receiver 1s. Like, not all wide receiver 2s are created equal. He's getting 26% targets per route run number. That's a decent wide receiver 1 number. And, we come back to one of my favorite stats year in, year out is first down per target. He led the league in 2022. In what was a down year, he was still 10th at 45%. Like, I think he's phenomenal talent in a phenomenal offense. And I think that this offense is going to take a change and shift that's going to benefit Jaylen Waddle. And as JJ said, the contingent upside is absolutely massive. Like, if Tyreek Hill, who's injured at the moment with a hand injury, if he was out for any prolonged period of time, Jaylen Waddle's probably worth a top 6 pick.
Yeah, and when we had Josh Norris on the channel talking about wide receivers, he mentioned with Jaylen Waddle that he had 23 catches for 306 yards in all third and fourth quarters last year because the Dolphins, they were just leading so often they could take their foot off the gas. The defense, it looks like it's going to take a step back. We know they lost Xavier Howard, Christian Wilkins, Jerome Baker, Shaq Barrett, who they signed this offseason, retired not so long ago. JJ, how much do you weigh defense into an offensive projection?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I look more so, though, at just general win totals and over-unders to look at what game script might look like, because that'll just tell you what game script might generally look like. I will say with numbers like that, I think that they're really interesting to look at and analyze, and we should be looking at it from like a regression standpoint for sure. The only thing is that, generally speaking, when teams get into those really favorable game scripts, it's because the offense did something to begin with, right? So the production was there to some degree. So I'm not dismissing it at all. It's still a thing that we absolutely need to factor in. But then there's that other side of like, because Baltimore is in a similar spot where Baltimore, like their pass rate over expected was actually like above average in some places, but it's at least like average, right? But they at the same time ran so many plays while leading that their overall pass rate was really, really low. And so I think that we should expect that to regress to some degree, but then you also have to just factor in like, okay, like they didn't run a lot of passing plays in the fourth quarter and stuff, but number one, they could still be pretty good this year, right? They're still going to see something there. But also, does that end up meaning that they're not as good in quarters 1 through 3, So there's also that to factor into. But yeah, I mean, I look at all that stuff, but at a baseline from like a projection standpoint, I'm usually looking at like team win totals.
Love it. Hit the subscribe button whilst you're here, people. We've got DFS, Dynasty, Redraft, Best Ball content all year round, multiple Best Ball drafts per week, redraft content coming out of our ears, closing in on 3,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button today. Kyler Murray, JJ, your second pick. This time a year ago, there was so much ambiguity over Kyler Murray. Like, was he even going to play in the season? People were talking about if the Cardinals sucked to such a level that they got a really high draft pick, would he be shipped out of town despite signing a new contract not too far behind that? Then he comes back from the ACL injury, the meniscus injury, averages 225 passing yards, 30 rushing yards per game, which was the 6th most among quarterbacks. JJ, I know you're high on Kyler Murray, but like, what's your kind of ceiling hope for Kyler Murray? Do you think top 3, maybe even QB1 overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think top 3 is definitely in his range of outcomes. My general stance is that Murray should be drafted a lot closer to Anthony Richardson than he currently is being drafted. And the reason for that is, he's coming off a major knee injury last year. He's in a new offense. He steps in and he averages 18.3 points per game. Some will say 18.3 is nothing special. I mean, it's kind of around where like Brock Purdy was last year, in an MVP season or MVP like season for Purdy. And the reason for that was not because of Kyler's passing. He had a 3.7% touchdown rate. His yards per attempt was below 7 last year. The reason for that was because of his rushing. And we should ask ourselves, should we expect the exact same type of performance from Kyler next year or this year when you get upgraded weapons? You get Marvin Harrison Jr. obviously added to that mix. You get another year in that offense, and you're now further away from that injury, as you noted. And to me, the answer is we should probably expect some sort of boost. And the question would be, okay, what can we just generally expect? Well, Kyler Murray, if you separate points per game via rushing only, Kyler Murray has seen 4.9 points per game via rushing every single year of his NFL career. He's been over 5 in 4 of 5 seasons. If you look at the 35 quarterbacks since 2011 who had 300 or more pass attempts, just to say that they were starters for most of the year, who then hit 5 or more points per game on the ground, of those 35 players, the lowest scored 17.7 points per game. 20 of the 35 hit 20 or more points per game. So we're drafting Kyler Murray at sort of an expectation of 18.5 to 19 fantasy points per game when we have better than 50-50 odds based on what he's done historically and what players have done historically who hit that 5 rushing points per game mark have done. And so to me, when you factor in the offensive environment, the better weapons, another year in this offensive system, again, I think that he really should be drafted a lot closer to Anthony Richardson than where he's being drafted. Now, finally, we're seeing the market sort of flip and say, let's get Kyler Murray at least where CJ Stroud's going, or sometimes above CJ Stroud. I think that he definitely should be drafted above CJ Stroud. And where you sort of get the question marks is with Anthony Richardson, depending on how you view a guy like Richardson based on the upside and such that we saw last year. So, right now, especially in like a home league or something, I think he's just a smash of a value. To me, it's kind of like there's always like one obvious value every year, it seems like, with a mobile quarterback. It was Jalen Hurts whenever he broke out, Josh Allen the year that he broke out, Lamar Jackson the year. And I know I'm doing it in hindsight, but there's always seems to be that one dude. This year, it very clearly looks like Kyler Murray.
Yeah, Rich, over on these redraft platforms, I mean, on Underdog, Kyler goes at 73. CBS, ESPN, he's going in the 70s as well. On NFL, he's going at pick 50. Yahoo, he's going at pick 55. Rich, are you still comfortable taking Kyler even that high?
I think it's all relative, isn't it? Like, yeah, I'm probably not comfortable taking Kyler 50th overall, but when you take into account that's QB8 at 50th overall, I'm probably a little bit more comfortable. I think the way QBs are drafted on NFL.com is different to basically any real platform, isn't it? So yeah, I don't love drafting him that high, but it's all relative depending on the platform you're playing on. But I love this shout because I think that, to agree with what JJ's saying, he's such a screaming value. You're sort of almost having to double take and say, like, what am I missing here? This is a guy, since his rookie year, he's finished 4th, 7th, and 9th in points per game, and we're getting him at QB8. And that QB 9th finish was because he was coming off the ACL injury. And it's like, so we're drafting a guy at his floor, and he's got massive upside. This is the best surrounding talent he's had his entire career. And I'm not just saying pure receivers. I'm talking in terms of the play caller, the offensive line, the complementary receiving weapons. This is the best set he's had his entire career. And yet we're drafting him at that floor. I just think he's such a screaming value. And yeah, someone that I'm trying to get as many shares of as I can. And is such an easy player to stack with Marvin Harrison or Trey McBride. It's almost makes too much sense to avoid it.
Yeah, definitely. And we've gotten into a debate before about whether Malik Neighbors or Marvin Harrison is the better value when it comes to best ball drafts and even in some of these redraft leagues. But if you're taking Marvin Harrison, it's such a layup to take Kyler Murray because you're betting on the overall outcome of Marvin Harrison being good. Then it's going to mean that Kyler Murray more than likely has a good season as well. And for me, I can't ignore Kyler because of the rushing upside that you've both mentioned. Since the start of the 2018 season, there's been 48 quarterbacks who've averaged 5 rush attempts per game. Of those 48, 64% finished as a top 12 quarterback in points per game. It is a cheat code, and you just have to get with the fact that fantasy football these days, it absolutely favors the rushing quarterbacks. And if you're going to lean towards the pocket passes, they need to be the true elite tier and hopefully add some kind of rush attempts per game like Patrick Mahomes does, who averages like 3.6 rush attempts per game. Moving on to the final pick from JJ, the sleeper pick that we wanted, Jaleel McLaughlin. And the experts who I've spoke to so far who are coming onto this show, there's been several of them who've kept mentioning this name. JJ, I know you've talked on your latest show about how important pass catching is for running backs in fantasy, but it just sets a baseline that is very difficult for others to compete with. Is the receiving volume what's leading you towards Jaleel McLaughlin?
Yeah, 100%. If you look at the last decade plus, so since 2011, and you look at team running back target shares, and you look at the top 17, you can look at the top 20. I choose top 17 because that's where the cutoff would be for this specific statistic. 8 of the top 17 team running back target share numbers have come from Sean Payton led teams. This is what his offense does. And this is not just a Alvin Kamara focused statistic. He's done this in multiple offenses with multiple running backs. Just last year, the Denver Broncos backfield led the NFL in running back target share. I think that we're going to see that again when you look at, or at least, towards the top, when you look at the pass catchers in that offense. You get a guy like Cortland Sutton, who's a good, not great player. It's not like he's this elite asset who's going to command a 28% target share. And then you have a bunch of dudes who we don't know exactly what we're getting from them, including the tight end position. And then, the backfield, sure, you can make the argument that of the guys back there, and I wouldn't even disagree, a guy like Javonte Williams probably has the most like bell cow upside, just given his size, given his prospect profile, and really what he's done already in the NFL. And I'm not trying to sell Jaleel McLaughlin as someone who's going to be a top 10, top 5 running back in fantasy football necessarily. I do think in a full PPR format or even a half PPR, he can get close to that top 20 range for sure if things sort of break his way. If he does see a 10, 11, 12% target share. Last year, he was by far the best running back in that backfield on a per touch basis, even when you adjust for the types of fronts that he was seeing. He's an undersized back that is a little frightening to invest in, but you're not having to invest a lot of capital in order to get him. And I really think that this could be a situation where we see Jaleel McLaughlin sort of play that Darren Sproles role that we've seen in this Sean Payton offense for years. To me, I always think about running backs in particular. It's easier with running backs as just where can I find some arbitrage, right? Like where, I really like Tajay Spears this year, for instance, but realistically, I remember having this conversation with Scott Connor actually a couple weeks ago at the Fantasy Football Expo, and we were hanging out and just chatting. I was like, yeah, I really like Tajay Spears for X, Y, and Z. And he was like, well, why draft Tajay Spears if you can just get like Austin Eckler, who's kind of an arbitrage on Tajay Spears? And I was like, well, why draft Austin Eckler when you can just get Jaleel McLaughlin? Right. So there's like, this is the archetype that we're talking about at the end of the day. Right. Of course, I don't think that he's going to necessarily have the early down work to the degree that someone like Javonte Williams will. But, we're speculating a little bit, but I think it's logical to think that Samaje Perine could be cut. And if he does get cut, then this is Jaleel McLaughlin's backfield as a receiver, because Javonte is more of an early down guy. He's going to see some work through the air, and he saw a decent amount of work through the air last year. Audric Estime is an early down bruiser. That's how he profiled as a prospect. And they've even outwardly said that he's an early down guy. I think that he kind of matches up and would replace Javonte Williams a lot more as a from an archetype standpoint than Jaleel McLaughlin. So yeah, Jaleel could see a lot of work through the air this year. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you're not investing a huge amount into him. He goes no earlier than 145 across all platforms. On NFL platform, if you're playing there, as my home league continues to do so, he's available at pick 220. Yeah. So absolutely worth scrolling down for. Rich, when you were putting together your rookie guide, which if anyone wants a copy, all they've got to do is hit the join button down below and they will get a free copy of 170 pages of great analysis on these rookies. Did you think it was just a layup that Bo Nix would succeed in a Sean Payton offense because he would be checking down to these running backs, Laius?
I feel like that's a leading question. I think it depends what you're saying by succeed. I think that Bo Nix can be a below average, competent NFL starting quarterback that completes a high percentage of passes and has fantastic fantasy numbers for a couple of options. Do I think he's going to be an all-pro, a guy that's going to lead them to several playoff runs and potentially win a title? No, absolutely not. But Bo Nix, he's the most experienced NFL college quarterback we've ever seen, and he does exactly what it says on the tin. He is going to complete a high percentage of low ADOT passes. So far through the 2 games in preseason, he's attempting 70% of his passes less than 10 yards downfield. That's fantastic for a guy like Jaleel McLaughlin. Like, he's not going to push the ball massively downfield. We've also seen so far in preseason that Jaleel McLaughlin's already started to work in some pass pro reps, which, okay, part of that might be let's see how he gets his feet wet and see if he can cope. But to me, that's the big thing, is if he's going to achieve that potential ceiling, he needs to be at least competent in pass protection. And because that's what Samaje Perine is probably one of the best in the league at, and that's what's going to keep Samaje Perine potentially on this roster. So if Jaleel McLaughlin can carve out that role and just be competent, he doesn't have to be good, just be competent, then that's going to be massive for his fantasy upside. I like the pick. I like the player. You look at the underlying stats, it's all there. My concern is if this stays a 3-headed backfield. At the moment, it's 4. But I think what we all think, either Perine's going to go, I know I've floated out Javonte getting traded potentially. If it stays as a 3-headed backfield, whether that's Estime, McLaughlin, and then one of Perine or Javonte, I'm nervous that there's not going to be enough volume in what's probably going to be a bottom 5-10 offense for McLaughlin to be reliable enough for you to start him in a managed leagues. I get it in best ball, absolutely, but in a managed leagues, I feel like he's going to be slightly boom bust, and you're never going to feel quite confident to kind of put him in that spot and kind of roll with him.
Yeah, JJ, is this one of those players where you'd feel happy drafting him in redraft, but you feel like we'll get an answer quite quickly as to whether he's going to be worth keeping around on redraft leagues?
Yeah, 100%. And I definitely think that it is a better in best ball type investment, just because you're not going to have to guess as to when some of these running backs might go off, because he does have big playability. Like, he has the ability to break a 60-yard touchdown and score that way. So I don't even disagree with the notion that in a managed league, it might be a little bit more difficult. But I do think that, if things break his way, like if they do get rid of Samaje Perine, that's going to trigger an obvious look towards McLaughlin's way, and that he could just be the receiving back out of that backfield. And then, like you said, we're going to get week 1, week 2. We're going to see what these snap shares look like. We're going to see what these backfield shares look like. And that's going to give us more confidence or not, with a guy like McLaughlin. And he's the kind of guy where if you don't see that volume early on, it's not going to be that big of a deal to cut him, mostly because that the ceiling is probably not really there in terms of him being like a top 5, top 10 guy. It's not like you're cutting like Braylon Allen or something, and then the very next week, Breece Hall goes down, knock on wood, and Braylon Allen is all of a sudden a top 10 running back in fantasy football. It's not like that. So I think it's an easier player to cut if you are in a managed league.
Yeah, and one thing's for sure, I think we can definitely chalk up a lot of checkdowns from Bo Nix. Last year, Russell Wilson led the league with a 19% checkdown rate when kept clean. That was 6% more than any other player, and I wouldn't be surprised if Bo Nix breaches the 20% mark. If you disagree with any of these players, or if you just agree and find them very agreeable, let us know in the comments. All you've got to do, subscribe, leave a comment on any of our videos this summer, and you will be entered into our summer giveaway for $100 in cold hard cash, 12 months free membership to all our premium content, and a $25 voucher for our merchandise store. JJ, anything in particular that the people need to be keeping an eye out from you at the minute?
I got lateround.com. You can check out the late round draft guide that's for sale right now. You can check out the Late Round podcast, where I spew a lot of this stuff that's in my brain. But yeah, other than that, I'm on Twitter at Late Round QB. But it was a pleasure, guys.